John 2:20. Dixerunt ego Judaei quadraginta et 6 annis edificatum est templum hoc, et tu tribus diebus excitabis illud? Therefore the Jews said, this temple was built in 46 years, that is 46 years, and you will raise it up again in 3 days. We have to add some punctuation here to make sense of this, as often. We've got to note that we have a question here, since there isn't really any obvious clue from the Latin syntax itself that we've got a question in the second half of this verse. But there it is nonetheless. If we were doing this according to the more frequent method in classical Latin, we would start a new sentence and say, excitabisne, are you going to raise it up in such and such a time? But of course, questions take many forms in the Latin of all periods, so this isn't a totally untoward thing that's happening. Dixerunt ego, third person plural, perfect, active, indicative. They said, who said? Judaei, the Jews, or perhaps the Jewish leaders is a better way to translate this in a more narrow sense. The Jews said to him, therefore, this temple. Now, this is a good example of when we need to look to the end of a sentence, sometimes to find a subject. The subject isn't always first. Most often, the order we have is subject, object, verb in Latin. But as we've seen many times, since our Latin translators here are trying to follow the Greek text quite closely, they're often doing syntactical things that are a little bit more alien to the typical Latin that one would have heard in the street, or indeed would have read in sort of higher level literature. This produced often an unpleasant effect in those men and women from a literary background, that is, who had been raised on kind of the greats of Latin literature. When they first read Latin translations of the Bible, even before the Vulgate, as Augustine did, for instance, they sometimes were repelled by its style because it didn't make sense to them why the syntax would be so tortured and the vocabulary would be so unusual, etc. And again, of course, this is to be explained in sort of the Greek/Hebrew hybrid nature of the texts that we're talking about, that were translated into Latin. So in our text here, the main thing to note is this expression of time, quadraginta et 6 annis. This is an ablative of time within which. When we talk about in the course of a certain amount of time, in the course of 8 days, or in the course of 46 years, or within the time spanned by 46 years, this temple, templum hoc, edificatum est. Third person singular, perfect, passive indicative. Why edificatum? Because, of course, the subject being modified by the first part of this compound verb is templum. That is to say, it's neuter. So we expect this first part of our two-part compound verb, the whole verb is made out of these two parts, to reflect in number and gender its subject. That only makes sense. Et tu tribus diebus, again, we've got the same kind of ablative here. Within 3 days, you will cause it to rise. You will erect it again. And what I'm saying for it there is just illud. And remember, this is part and parcel of the Vulgate's rather free use of demonstratives in Latin. They don't always carry the full signification of farther demonstrative, as with illa, illa, illud, or closer demonstrative or near demonstrative with hic, haec, hoc. Sometimes they more or less just fill in for the regular third person pronoun, and that's what we have here.